So welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. I suppose I should actually say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because I know from the registrations we have people joining from all over the world, which is fantastic. And in fact, we had over 300 people register for this webinar, which is great. And I think for us, it really demonstrates that this is both an incredibly important topic, but also an urgent one. So the webinar today is titled Collective Bargaining, Rethinking Workplace Relationships for Better Outcomes. And indeed, as I say, it is an incredibly important topic. And I think we've seen high profile examples in recent days, weeks, months, and years. I mean, in the news in the last few days about Volkswagen in Germany, and the news that they might be shutting three facilities and manufacturing plants, affecting potentially 10% of the workforce. We've seen things in the US with port workers and operators, although that's thankfully been resolved. And in the UK, we've seen a lot of action recently from the RMT. And actually, when putting together this webinar, from a marketing perspective, I was very keen to talk up about how much activity there's been in recent years, until Malcolm, one of our speakers, reminded me actually what we're seeing at the moment pales in comparison to what we've actually seen in the past on the industrial relations front, which is an important point to say. But linked to that, it's important to mention that there's a whole generation of people out there, professionals, who have had limited experience of industrial reaction, particularly when it goes to a dispute stage. And that means it's more important now more than ever that organizations take the time to think about how they're going to approach this challenge and opportunity. I'd just like to briefly, before we get going, talk a little bit about CEDR, if I can make the slides work. So people on this webinar might know us very well. You might not know us at all. But I think what we'd just like to say about CEDR is that we help individuals, teams, and leadership across the disputes and conflict spectrum. So this involves empowerment with skills and processes to resolve escalated disputes, but also what needs to be in place to prevent conflict escalation. And on the other side of the coin of conflict is looking at how can people leverage the potential of conflict to achieve better outcomes. And actually, that's a great segue into the webinar, because that's really what we're looking at: rethinking workplace relationships for better outcomes. I should say that this meeting is being recorded, and a recording will be available to everyone afterwards. Susanna mentioned at the start that please use the chat function throughout. We have baked in time at the end for questions, but if we don't get an opportunity to cover them today, we'll look to do so in the following days and weeks. So please use the chat function at all times. And that takes me neatly on to our speakers, our three expert speakers, who I'm now going to introduce themselves, starting with Malcolm.
Hi there, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world, from me, Malcolm Curry. I think where I'm coming from on this, I think can be summed up by my morning today, where I started off speaking to somebody from a company that supplies support services to the energy generation sector in the UK, who are wanting to have a good discussion about how they approach negotiations with the people that they need to cover off. Followed by a session that I was leading with the Ethical Trading Initiative, who are looking at industrial relations and particularly collective bargaining at different elements of their supply chains. So that gives a kind of an indication of the breadth of things that I'm currently dealing with.
Thanks, Malcolm. Suze?
Yeah, so I'm CEDR's Director of Training and Consultancy, and I think that work, whilst I'm not a labor relation specialist, we get more and more drawn into that work. So currently I'm working with an organization, the management team and the staff union. They want to negotiate their terms of working together. And I realized how strong identities are of both groups and the value I can add as a facilitator to help them change perspective. But at the same time, both parties asked, can we be trained first in how to negotiate? Because we don't really know how to do this in a principled way. So we agreed that we first train them all in negotiation skills so that they find a constructive way to do that. So we're combining the facilitation with actually bringing them all up to speed to have the same language and skills to do that. So I think all the qualities and skills you need as a mediator and facilitator are required, plus actually understanding the different perspectives they're coming from.
Thank you, Suze. And Felicity?
Hi, I'm Felicity Stedman, and my input is a little like Malcolm in terms of what I'm working with at the moment and what I saw coming into my inbox this morning, as well as the conversations I was having this morning. I'm currently working on 3 different employment-related disputes: a wage dispute between a trade union and a company, a dispute between a company and an employee over whether that person is an employee and whether their termination is an unfair dismissal. And the answers to both questions will, of course, influence the settlement negotiations, so that's a mediation. And then a conflict in a workplace between 3 employees following an allegation of harassment. So we work at many different levels in organizations. These are 3 different levels in 3 different organizations, because as we know, the potential for conflict exists wherever you find people and in all organizations. It's a normal phenomenon. So our work is very much helping people, as Ben said to start with, manage that conflict and achieve better outcomes.
I'm now going to stop sharing the screen. And what we wanted to do was actually, and this idea came from the pre-discussion that I had with Felicity, Malcolm, and Suze, is that they all have an incredibly rich and different perspective on this vast and incredibly important topic. So we thought it might be nice to kickstart the webinar by just diving into a little bit more detail, their individual perspectives and experience in this field. So that's how we'd like to start. And then from there, we'll go on to look at some key themes and elements related to collective bargaining, and then moving on to the practicalities, the so what element, what can you do about it? So perhaps if we could start with Felicity, if you would like to share with us a little bit more about your perspective and your background.
Thanks, Ben. I started my working life at age 15 as a Saturday girl, which I've learned in recent years is a term in the UK for young girls who work on Saturdays, often in hairdressers. And my experience was working in shops and restaurants over many years to supplement my studies and my income as a young person. And then in the early 1980s, my career started in the field of industrial relations. I was in South Africa at that time. Very high conflict, levels of high conflict between trade unions and management, because workers in the country had fought for many years for the right to freedom of association, and it had just been hard won. Believe it or not, until 1980, 81 in South Africa, Black workers, who are the majority of workers, could not join trade unions. So the 80s and the 90s were a flurry of activity over recognition agreements, collective bargaining. All of those experiences, my own experience as an employee and my experience in the industrial relations field, really taught me the importance of dialogue in the workplace, and how if management and employees respect one another and had formal channels to talk and negotiate, better outcomes could be achieved. So, you know, all those recognition negotiations over policies and procedures and basic setting in place the foundations of respect and then future collective bargaining. So these days, I often find myself asking the young Saturday girls or staff in organizations what it's like working there, whether they've joined a union, because my passion has always been supporting employers and employees to have positive employment relations. I hope I haven't caused any problems in organizations, but I certainly feel it makes a huge difference if people can speak up safely, and makes a difference not just for the employee, but also for the employer, who then understands more accurately what's going on in the business.
Thank you, Felicity. Malcolm, if we could move to you.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, my background is obviously quite different to that, having sort of been born and brought up in Scotland and the UK. I'm actually a zoologist in my background. So that was my initial career, was working in nature conservation. And actually that gives you quite a good grounding in negotiation, because you're basically working with landowners, occupiers, and things like that, trying to persuade them to do things differently. Through that, I was also a trade union representative in the organisation where I was, which ultimately led to me negotiating a whole series of redundancies and relocation packages to do with a particular move of the headquarters location, which led to me being offered a full-time job with the trade union as a negotiator, which I did for just under 12 years. Towards the end of my time as a negotiator, though, which was fascinating, and it was a good union to work for, Prospect Union in the UK, which operates across public, private, and third sectors. So it was quite good for getting good breadth, good range of organisation sizes, from ones that had only sort of like 10 or 15 staff up to tens of thousands. But as I went through it, first of all, I became much more interested in the whole interaction between management and staff, as a concept, and the whole idea of the potential for partnership working, and the strength and the sort of the benefits that would come for all parties from doing that. But I also noticed some patterns in certain organizations, and there was a particular thing that I'd realized, which was there were some organizations when I would go into the negotiation, and as a negotiator, I was there full time. I had lay representatives with me who I had possibly trained. There might be people from other trade unions there as well, so full-time officer with people that they have as lay reps who they'd trained as well. And we'd pre-met and we were prepared, ready to go in. And it was incredibly frequent that the following scenario would play out, where the director of resources or finance director or whoever it was that was responsible for leading the negotiation would come into the room. And almost always they were a very adept commercial negotiator. But very rarely did they actually have significant in-depth knowledge about industrial relations, collective bargaining, and the way that trade unions operate. And they would be accompanied by somebody who was, from the HR function, usually a business partner. Occasionally they were, a head of or director, but usually they were somebody who was at a lower grade and didn't actually have the leverage to actually influence the negotiation as much as they might have done with their professional background. And then very frequently there was another director who would come in as well. And they were kind of there to make up the numbers, and very often spent the time getting frustrated that this was getting in the way of them going and doing proper work. And the number of times I saw that happening, and I sort of thought, you know what, in 15 minutes, we're going to be having a heated conversation. In half an hour, it's going to be an argument. By 45 minutes, we're going to be in a dispute, simply because we're not all working to the same agenda. We're not all operating on the same, on the same, for the same outcomes. And I thought that there's something I can do about that. And that was what persuaded me to set up my business, to go and actually help companies resolve that whole area and get themselves in a position where they can interact much more constructively with the trade unions. That's not to say there's going to be agreement, but again, my objective has always been to encourage people towards constructive disagreement, where you can actually have conversations about the things that are the points of disagreement. So that's where I'm coming from when I go into this whole area.
Perfect. Thank you, Malcolm. And Suze?
Yeah, so I grew up big part of my life in Germany, where work councils and trade unions play an important role. And I worked a big part of my life also in France, where la grèvomanie, strike, is basically the normal life is the exception to strike. And I learned also when I grew up, when I was a teenager in the 80s and 90s, to go on the street to demonstrate. I was a student demonstrating against student fees, against nuclear arms, etc. So it was a normal thing to give a voice to a debate. And I discovered really the effect, how important it is to create a coalition of the weak, give a voice to the voiceless. And I also realized how important it is to get a certain education in how to voice what you want to say, and to debate and argument, to Malcolm's point, how to have a constructive disagreement. Something which in Germany, we invented even a word for that, which is called Streitkultur, a culture of argument, which I think we unlearned a little bit now, and it would be good to bring it back. I then embarked, I thought to become a lawyer is the closest I can get to help people to find their voice. And a long story, I ended up doing different things. I then became a mediator. But I learned through my education as a lawyer and working in that field that access to justice is something that is not, I took that for granted when I grew up, but it's not for everyone true. And what is justice as well? But just to have a democracy where you can argue, where you're not necessarily put in prison for what you say, and you have work conditions where you actually get paid for holidays, etc. I worked in factories as a student as well, not as a Saturday girl, but it was like factory work. And when you're a student, I think everyone should really experience that once, because it's a very different way and attitude how you do that. And it was almost like a family, and you have to earn the right to join that family. And there's a very strong identity. So I learned a lot about tribal behavior, identity. And what I'm currently doing is I do business and human rights dispute resolution. And there's always one like big corporate and a community in some part of the world affected by environmental impact or modern slavery or work issues, a lot of different things. And at the beginning, I always thought, okay, there's the weak and there's the strong. And once you start getting into dialogue, you see there's power on both sides. And it's for parties often very difficult to see that, and to have almost like the luxury of a facilitator helping to engage, but also save face, to find, to frame things and demands, and actually give people the power to move from being a victim to actually be someone who can create their destiny, but also giving the so-called perpetrators who have a label, you are the big corporate who always do evil, to actually give them an opportunity to step in and be more creative in how to build this relationship and engage with communities, is, I think, a very interesting space. And currently we are involved in a lot of so-called investment facilitations and bilateral investment treaty negotiations, which will have an impact on labor disputes. Because if a country decides we will have a treaty to trade rare earths or something, there will be exploitation of labor. There will be impact on environment that needs to be negotiated before the damage happens. And we come later to ESG, because I think that is all about the S in ESG, but I will say something later about that.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for those introductions. If I could move on now to the meat of the discussion and start with one of our core themes, which is around rethinking mindsets and approaches to collective bargaining.
Good morning, everybody.
Oh,
Rakesh Kalla, advocate from India, working in Supreme Court and High Court.
thank you.
First
Could
of
you just
all,
please mute your chat with this? If you have any comments or questions, please add them to the chat area.
okay, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, so the thing, moving on to the first key theme, if we could look at this concept of social dialogue, and Felicity, could you kick us off on that area, please?
Yeah, sure. So social dialogue is a term I think probably coined best by the ILO, and their whole focus, the International Labour Organization, their whole focus is on promoting effective social dialogue. So who are the partners in this social dialogue? Obviously, employers and employers' organizations, and employees and employee organizations, be they at the level of works councils, like in Germany, or formal trade unions, and then the state. And the state really is there in two capacities. One is as a very big employer in many countries, but also there as the sort of guardian of legislation and the provider of mechanisms for managing the conflict. Um, so, and social dialogue, what is the process? So those are the actors. What is the process? Well, it ranges from simply sharing information and with employees, with management, through to consultation. And we know that in many recognition agreements in this country and in other countries, there's a formal provision for consultation, and it's very clear what the issues are over which there will be consultation. And then negotiation, and again, very clear what the issues are that are suitable for negotiation. And in economies like Germany, there's joint decision making, where there are certain decisions that the organization can't make without the agreement of the trade union or the works council. So social dialogue is all about how those actors interact and work together. And maybe I could just add that in many countries like the UK and in South Africa, the state has recognized that it's useful that employers and employees can step into a forum that is not managed by the state to resolve disputes. So ACAS, and in South Africa, the CCMA, the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration, are forums that are managed by all social actors, all of the social partners um, on the board and so on, but they are completely independent of the state. So labour management and the state as employers, or as parties, need to be able to go to a forum that is independent, and ACAS and the CCMA and others provide this forum. So yeah, regulating, managing, and promoting dialogue between the main partners.
Malcolm, your take on the concept of social dialogue.
There's not an awful lot to argue with in terms of what Felicity was just saying. I think one of the key things that in a lot of the worldwide models, and probably apart from the ones that we have in the UK, is how common the feature of tripartism is, and the fact that at the negotiating table you will have that representative from the governmental area, usually employment departments. And I mean, it leads to one of the areas that I do a significant amount of work is with the International Labour Organization through their International Training Centre, training labour negotiators, most of whom are working through whatever the Department of Employment is called in their country. So that's happening worldwide as part of a move to from the ILO to actually increase the use of social dialogue across employers across the world. Now, it's kind of grown from the traditional interactions between management and unions that we have in this country and have kind of taken for granted, to be honest. And actually, I think it would be useful in the UK for us to reflect back on the need and the value that comes from social dialogue, both for the workforce and for the company. And I think it's actually part of what underpins the views that I quite often share with people about management staff partnerships. And I think then looking for some kind of leadership from government might be the missing part of that in a UK context, but it's very commonly there in other countries.
I think it's also quite valuable to contrast this approach, this partnership approach to labor relations with other approaches. So in the UK, we come from a history of, if you think of the Quaker businesses, Cadbury's and Rowntree and all of them, where, the mindset was management knows what's in your interests, employees, and we will look after you, don't worry. So company housing, all sorts of welfare benefits. But time has moved on, and really, what is important to appreciate is the using Susanna's reference to power, really the power that both parties have and the rights that both parties have to have these conversations. And I think we've seen it in the kind of speak up culture that has been so much more prevalent these days, that people are more aware of their rights and are more confident about speaking up. And in new collectives, look at the tech industry, look at online working, where people are working in different ways. They're feeling more confident about speaking up about things that are unsatisfactory. So you might not be dealing with a traditional trade union. You might simply be dealing with a group of employees, roughly organized in the workplace. Those conversations are just so important to have, as opposed to shutting it down.
Which is of course something that happens nowadays, that in the so-called cancel culture, which I think is that you want to encourage people to speak up, at the same time you don't want to hear a different opinion, because it's sometimes painful to hear something you don't want to hear. And I think in the UK, as far as I understood, not being from here, is a lot of the labor issues were also class-based. So there was basically the humans, the workforce as a liability, going to becoming the human capital. And now we speak about people are the asset. So whilst that is true, it's almost like, how does society catch up with that? Whilst in the UK, I would personally say class plays still a dominant role and is in people's minds. It's how can you step out of your class and listen to the other side, which doesn't mean you have to accept what they say, but at least to start to listen, to perhaps to seek to understand, is something that doesn't come automatically. It's something you need to practice and you can actually learn to do. But if you've never been encouraged or empowered to question that, or that you have more power than you think, I think that's an important step to social dialogue. And the word dialogue, it means you actually speak, interact, listen, is something to create that human capital or social capital.
Yeah.
Malcolm, you wanted to say something, I think.
Yeah, no, it's just the thing that was coming to my mind as well was some of the research that has been done in relation to the changes that are happening as we move through the generations. So moving from millennials through to Generation Zs, and I can't remember what the one that comes after that is.
I think it's Alpha.
It's Alpha, yeah, who are just probably just about to start coming into the workplace, probably. But as we've moved through those generations, the evidence seems to suggest that people are becoming more values driven as they move down through that area. And there's a whole area there where that leads to a different set of potential conflict in the workplace, based on exactly the things you were just talking about, Susanna, there. Whereby, and actually referring back to what Felicity was saying about the sort of the employer knowing best and sort of providing for the needs, those kind of things aren't actually catered for if you start looking at it with somebody who's driven more by values than they are by reward in the form of money, for example. So there's a whole area there that actually I think that whole point of listening to people and having that dialogue becomes more and more important, because without having the dialogue, without having the listening piece that's in there, how do you actually know what's important to that group of people? And if you don't know what's important to them, how do you actually meet that need? How do you actually provide them with what they need in order to deliver the work that you as an employer need to have delivered? And it's a changing area, and I think that's partly what's feeding into the uptick in terms of dispute. I mean, obviously there are economic circumstances in that, but I think there's also been, because we've had a long spell when there's been a lot of stability in the economy, during which there were very, very few disputes. I mean, I think it was at 2011, I think there were only about 250,000 days lost to industrial action. And that was the low, but it was around that level for over a decade. And I think a lot of people have actually forgotten about how to have some of those conversations. And that's really been one of the big drivers behind things happening now, and the fact that it's perceived as being such a big problem. Whereas, you go back 20 years, what we're looking at the moment would just have been normal. In fact, it would probably been, whoa, it's quite light,
And on that subject of dialogue and conversation and exchange, Felicity, I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on why it's so important to have better quality conversations, not just when you're involved in formal processes, but also informally and at all stages. Yes, just really expanding on that better quality conversation piece.
Yeah. So we really come from a place, and the model, the industrial relations model we've been talking to, is based on the idea that conflict is pretty inevitable where you find people, because we have different interests. We also have a lot of common interests. And sometimes the common interests get a bit overlooked when we get into a conflict over those different interests. And so the kind of conversations that happen in the workplace are not just at the level of, if there's a trade union, at the level of collective bargaining and recognition agreements, but at the level of the production line, the office, the monthly meetings between employees and employers, the consultation that we were talking about. And in all of those meetings, there's this potential for conflict. I mean, just today, I was having a conversation with a trade union who were talking simply about the way in which management were speaking to them, the words they were using, the tone of voice. And their experience of that was dismissive and undermining and, not recognizing or respecting the contribution that their members have made to the organization for many years. So we do a lot of work at that level of helping people have those conversations. It may be how to run a meeting. I was thinking back as I was thinking about today, thinking back to that amazing video John Cleese made in the 80s. I think it was called Meetings, Bloody Meetings. Excuse my language. And how, that was a business meeting, but actually we spend our lives in meetings, online and in person. How can we make those meetings more productive, more respectful, have a clearer purpose, etc. So, that's really what we're looking at. And when Malcolm talked about training, a lot of that training is really how to have a conversation. It's the active listening skills, it's structuring the conversation with a clear purpose, a beginning, a middle, and an end, minute taking, that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think there's a lot we can all do to just improve the quality of our conversations.
And Susan, your thoughts on that within the sort of collective bargaining space, but the wider work that you're also doing around stakeholder engagement, the sort of better quality conversations piece?
Yeah, that is really to the point also what Malcolm mentioned. I think, Malcolm, even you introduced him to the iceberg of ignorance, so that management And that is true not only for organizations, but it's in leadership functions or in the government as well. They know almost just 2 to 4% of the issues that are actually going on, whilst the communities or the workers, they know where the issues are. And Toyota started with introducing, actually talking to the production lines where the issues are, so they could actually then really become top leaders and improve their services. We are also, when CEDR started, it started because there was a need for an emergency service, how to de-escalate dispute. And now going into organizations, sometimes we are called in, like what Felicity and Malcolm just also mentioned, when the dispute is already super escalated. And we really try to calm them down to actually get back to their senses to be able to have a conversation. From the work I'm mostly involved in is about conflict prevention, conflict resilience, where you want not to get to that point. It's very time expensive, resource, money, everything to do that. So there are a lot of mechanisms out there still how to deal with conflict and how to mitigate that, or how to conduct a grievance process or an investigation. And I think, why don't we start much earlier? And it sounds so simple, but it's not trivial at all. Why don't you just ask and engage the community, the workforce, whoever it is? And yes, you might hear difficult messages and feedback, but you get to the root cause rather than treating the symptoms, and everything blows up again after a few months of negotiations, like the strike negotiations here in the UK with the transport happened. So you go to the root cause and ask and engage the stakeholders early on is something which is key. And you not only need to train people, but it's almost that awareness to design your processes, the business processes around that. What Felicity, what you said as well around meetings. Meetings should be targeted in at least once per month to discuss these issues, whilst other meetings should just be dedicated to action that. Felicity, I had the feeling you wanted to.
Yes, I wanted to actually pick up on Brian Bowden's question, because I think it relates to some of this. And his question in the chat is about noise management within collective bargaining and the sort of quality of the conversations often that we see, or they're not even conversations, the kind of statements being made in social media, emphasizing difference and extremes. And yes, of course, people take those positions, and you know, both management and trade unions have a constituency to speak to, and to reassure that they're doing their job and they're representing the interests of their party. However, when you get around the table, you can do it in a better way. So when we train organizations in negotiation skills, we of course recognize the very positional, demand-driven style that is usually where parties start. We would then help them consider how you shift back from that, and how you make it a richer conversation with a more interest-based conversation. And also in those, in many of the negotiations we've facilitated, we would actually have a conversation about managing the media, or how to operate within the media, or social media as well. Because of course it doesn't help the negotiations if there is all that noise going on. But there's often nothing much you can do about the noise. It's more about the quality of the conversation at the table.
Okay, thanks.
Can I maybe come in and follow on that? Mainly from the point of view of when do you actually do the consultation? When do you actually do that involvement? And this all comes back to some research that was done probably 15, maybe 20 years ago now. But it was looking at the whole aspect of what's the right time to draw somebody in if you're going to avoid a conflict. And in any decision making, you've basically got a stage when somebody realizes we have to make a decision in the company. You then draw in a slightly bigger group to work out, well, what is the decision that needs to be made? What are the options that are available? You then move forwards to a stage where you're looking to actually finalize the decision and start putting in place the things that need to happen in order to get that in place. After which you're then looking to have that decision implemented and fully accepted across the piece. The research, and this was done it was actually published as a book, which is called Strategic Partnership and Trade Unionism, or it might be the other way around. But the question in that was, at what point in that process is the knowledge of the staff brought into that? Bearing in mind that for most companies, the staff is not only their most expensive resource, it's their most valuable resource, as almost every chief executive will tell you, that they're investing in. But what they're really investing is intellectual capital. So those staff know so much about the company. So at what point do you draw in that knowledge? Well, you know, the answer usually is that it's right at the tail end. It's when you're trying to implement the decision. And the model that was looked at in the research said, well, if you do that, then the only response that the staff can have, if there's something that they see as wrong about the decision that's being made, is they can only fight against it. So you end up boxing. If you involve them earlier, draw in their knowledge at the stage where you're maybe defining the problem more precisely. You're maybe trying to work out what are the options, what do they look like, who's got suggestions in there. If you draw them in at that kind of a stage, you're still interacting with them, but instead of boxing, you can dance. So you're not necessarily reaching immediate agreement. There's still the interaction, but do you want to be dancing or do you want to be boxing? And early engagement, early involvement of that knowledge is really crucial in terms of avoiding going more precipitously towards the dispute, and actually then accessing the information underneath the iceberg of ignorance that Susanna mentioned earlier on.
Perfect. And that leads us nicely to the sort of so what element of the webinar. So we've talked about social dialogue. We've talked about, Malcolm just mentioned, accessing the intellectual capital of your workforce. We've talked about the need and importance and benefit of better conversations. I think it would now be good, and Felicity already mentioned a little bit earlier about active listening and designing processes, but to take a closer look at, okay, so what is actually needed on the ground, the day-to-day realities, the skills, the processes to leverage all the benefits and ideals that we've talked about. And I wonder, Felicity, if you could start us with, you know, what do you see work well, and what kind of investments are organizations making to reap these benefits?
Well, it really starts with a mindset shift, a shift really to accepting and being open to having these conversations at different levels in the organization. It may not mean, in the first place, recognizing a trade union. It may be, in many organizations, simply setting up structures for consultation and discussion. Certainly responding effectively to any speaking up that people initiate. And seeing employee representation as not as a threat or a threat to management prerogative and, you know, undermining, but as an opportunity really to tap into the resources that employees offer, and also to prevent a dispute and prevent and manage conflict better. So I think a mindset shift, and you know, in this country, there are incredible resources in the UK, incredible resources online to simply understand the whole area of industrial relations. And I'm sure the same is in many other countries. And then, you know, once having got your mind around it, then, and my colleagues can talk about training, facilitating relationship building initiatives to get parties to different place in their relationship.
Suze, Malcolm, I wonder if one of you wanted to follow on.
Yeah, so perhaps just to jump in, I think we mentioned skills, and it's often lightly mentioned we need the skills. I think there's the skills, the confidence, and also the courage to do that. And for me, the key point, and I mentioned the S in ESG, the S is about building social capital. Again, big words. It just means giving people the education and the tools and the know-how, means that people can feel in power, control, and confident to do something about it. So I think for me, it's like giving people the superpower, which is the dialogue skills, the listening, the process design, to find their voice. So currently we were involved in different companies in public sector, international organizations, and private sector, to teach how to speak up. And we often question then, you can't teach someone to speak up. You need to create an environment where processes are in place that people feel they can do that, they can dare to speak up and disagree, and at the same time equip people how they can voice messages in an assertive way to address things, and also how to find allies. I think it's what we mentioned earlier, to build a coalition, to find a voice together, and how to do that in a non-violent way and still in an assertive way, and not just being indifferent or ignorant. I think we all, what we mentioned, the times where we gone on the streets and demonstrated, I think we need to bring back a bit that spirit, not being violent and canceling everyone, not in that meaning, but to step up, to speak in an assertive way and have allyship, how to engage meaning in a meaningful way, not canceling, in an engaging and also listening.
Actually, my experience in South Africa has been the huge value in joint union management negotiations. Just as Malcolm has said, so that once they get to the table, they can concentrate on the content, and they've kind of got a sense of what the process should be, and their relationships are also stronger, because that joint training is an opportunity for relationship building as well. And what is also hugely useful, and we do quite a bit of, is facilitating relationship building exercises, usually post something dramatic, like post redundancy, post a strike, when both sides need to pick up the pieces. So how do you do that? Often without the involvement of a third party, when people are so pitched against one another. And that can be enormously helpful. Not to talk about the substantive issues that have been the substance of the dispute, but to talk about, well, you know, our relationship is now in tatters. How do we move forward? And of course, that can be also very helpful just with teams. It doesn't have to be a kind of organization-wide thing. Just taking a team that's been through some drama and saying, okay, how can we help you rebuild relationships here so that you can work together productively?
And I think also to Eve's point in the comment about confidentiality, I just can say that some of the negotiations I did on the business human rights side, confidentiality was quite important, because each side has to convince their constituents about the deal. So that often you have the two, let's say you have the negotiation teams, but then there are all the members of that team, which is often most equally difficult to negotiate with. So you need almost to work out what Yuri calls a victory speech with each negotiator, and say, what do you need to deliver to your team that you can sell that deal, and at the same time be open to negotiate. So that is something which we call negotiation coaching, which happens normally in confidence, because you want to work out best worst case scenarios, but also how to save face. What are their worst fears? They might never share that with the other side, or you help them frame how to share that they don't weaken their position. It's still also important to recognize the negotiation position of each party for future relationships as well. So I think that is quite a key point and skill, which perhaps you can teach, but it's also then, I think, good to have a third party there who can do that, because you don't have any interest in the outcome of the negotiation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe also just to respond to Hugh's question here about how easy it is for misunderstanding to develop, where there's a misunderstanding about the distinction between consultation and negotiation, or what consultation means, how easily that can really escalate and cause what could have been clarified very early on into something much bigger. And then just in relation to Eve's question, yes, confidentiality is a little different in the collective bargaining area, because each party is responsible to a constituency and must go back and report. So you will have conversations about how that will happen. And as Susanna says, to sort of help people write their victory speech. But the conversations in the room will remain confidential. So those principles still hold.
Fantastic. Well, unfortunately, I dropped out because of technical difficulties momentarily, so slightly lost where we were. But it sounds like we've really covered a lot of the sort of the training aspect. And forgive me if I'm going over and something we've already covered. But the sort of process design element, so really thinking strategically and consciously about how you bring people together, when, which individuals and who not to include. Is that something we've already covered, or is it worth just discussing briefly now?
I think the thing that immediately came to my mind is when you said about who should or shouldn't be involved. One of the key problems with an awful lot of disputes is the fact of not having the proper decision maker in the room. Now that's more difficult for a union, because ultimately, as a democratic structure, unions can make a recommendation to their membership, but ultimately the membership will decide. But the people in the room can decide on what recommendation goes to that membership when it's going out there. Very often, I've had to take part in negotiations, or I've observed them, or I've facilitated them, where one of the key difficulties is that the people actually making the decision are not in the room. And it really does cause a problem. And the only alternative to them not being in the room is for them to have properly delegated the authority. But so often that doesn't happen properly. And that's partly because of the skill sets of people around. And there's I noticed there was a question about or a comment in relation to the training of the people in the railway dispute that I talked about. Now, those people had been trained, but they hadn't all been trained together, and they had different understandings of the terminology that we're using. Now, they could have got round that by having a conversation about exactly that point. And possibly that's one way forwards, but also probably I don't know from the individuals that were involved in it, because I don't know them. But it's very possible that the training that they had was 15, 20, 25, or even more years ago. And a lot of the thinking about good practice in negotiations, and particularly about good practice in relation to industrial relations and collective bargaining, has changed in that time. There's been a lot of research, there's been a lot of collecting together of what actual good practice looks like, and it's changed since that. So if you're dealing with people who've been trained at different periods of time, then it may be that they have a different approach. I know when I first started as a union negotiator, as a representative, I was trained to be very, very positional in my approach. Now, I was then retrained to be very much, trying to find out what the needs and interests were of everybody who was sitting around the table. And that's been the real change in thinking in relation to how you go about doing a negotiation. So that's where some of those issues can come from. But get the decision maker in the room and it solves a lot of problems.
Yeah, I've always taken the view that anyone who might be the obstacle to signing off on this deal needs to be in the room or needs to be very close by and accessible. So just as confidentiality is a key principle in any mediation, authority and having a mandate and having the authority to negotiate and sign off on a deal is another key principle. So, one would always check that and make sure that the people in the room at least have full authority to negotiate, and that the person who signs off, if they're not in the room, they're very close by.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, I'm conscious of time and we've gone over already slightly. So if there are any further questions, please do put them in the chat. I understand people may have to leave, but there was one from Jerry Fallon about where does trust sit within such dynamic negotiating environments? I wonder if we could briefly tackle this before doing a quick wrap up, because I think it's quite a good question.
Yeah. If I can maybe pick that one up first, because I noticed that when it came in, and I was thinking trust is so important in all of this. And that's why when we were talking earlier on, we were talking about the importance of building the relationship. It's why Susanna said, meetings at least monthly, things, and those kind of elements that are coming in there. If you don't have trust, it's going to be very difficult to negotiate this time. But also to remember, you're going to have to come back and negotiate with those people again. And you may have to come back and negotiate with them again. So building a relationship that improves over time means that you have enough trust to say, actually, I disagree with you. Here's why I disagree with you. And here's my alternative suggestion. And that's when the negotiation becomes a genuinely creative process.
And I think trust is, it's an elusive thing. There was that wonderful quote by, I think, a Belgian prime minister hundreds of years ago who talked about trust coming on foot and leaving on horse. And really, that's so true. It is an elusive and very delicate thing in any relationship. So it needs to be something that is attended to throughout the year, not just at the time of collective bargaining. It needs to be attended to in monthly meetings, in discussions in the office, on the shop floor. And it's also interesting to think about, well, what builds trust? And I think one of the many things that builds trust is when people do what they say they're going to do. And that's not difficult to demonstrate on both the part of a union and an employee and management. So it's a whole topic on its own. It is elusive. There's a lot you can do to build it over time, not just before negotiations.
Perfect.
Sorry, to Eve's point, that also includes the duty of care afterwards. So I think if you build a relationship, it's not a transaction. I think it's often seen as a transactional thing, deal done, move on. I think it's also giving people the benefit of the doubt. And we're talking about trust credit, but so you build that relationship, which means if something happens that is perhaps not consistent with the behavior, that you first think, okay, I have to give the benefit of the doubt that this might be just an exception and I'm curious to learn more. So maintaining that sort of curiosity helps to maintain also the post relationship, because circumstances change, COVID happened, etc. So it has all an impact. So that's why it's important to keep, even if there's no conflict, a contact to get to know, to keep each other posted of what is going on and be more sensitive to changes, that so you can react before you have to de-escalate.
There's just one final point which has come through as a private message to me, and it picks up on the point that Malcolm made around thinking around negotiation changing. But akin to how you're always improving your technical skills, you've also got to continue to work, refresh, and enhance your interpersonal negotiation communication skills. So how important is that aspect to investing in how you deal with this particular challenge or opportunity? To open that up to the panel.
I think I would say on that it's not only about conflict management, it's about conflict prevention. We can't avoid conflict. As I've been saying, it's very much a part of our world, but we can prevent it by strategies to deal with it. So a recognition agreement is all about preventing and managing conflict, having monthly meetings, giving employee representatives access so that they can talk to their members and to management, et cetera, et cetera. So think about how you can, how you can not only deal with the manifestations of conflict when it occurs, but what can you do to moderate conflict as it's developing? Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I think we have
Sorry,
gone
can I
7
make
minutes
one
over.
final point on that?
Yeah,
then?
please, Malcolm. Yeah.
Sorry. No, it was just because the other thing that I've very frequently seen is from the employer side, people coming in and they've clearly not prepared properly for the negotiation that they're about to have. So they don't have the information to hand that they need. And they often don't have a real vision as to where they're actually trying to get to. Quite often they're not aware of what their needs are or how to actually bottom that out. So getting to a position where they understand the processes enough that they can be properly prepared, I think is just a really important aspect in preventing themselves from falling into the trap of a future dispute.
Perfect. And a fantastic note to end on, I think. So we have run slightly over, so I appreciate everyone who stays. Thank you to everyone who has attended. Thank you to everyone who has contributed comments and questions. We really appreciate it. Those that we didn't manage to address today, we'll look to do so in the coming days. Everyone will receive a copy of the recording and any follow-up content we have in this area. So it just leaves me to thank you all for joining and to thank our fantastic panel. I think their passion and expertise in this area really came across, and it shows what an interesting, dynamic, and important challenge collective bargaining is. So thank you very much on behalf of CEDR for joining.